Welcome. Thank you all for joining for tonight's class. Pandemics, we're all familiar with that word. It used to be an abstract, and currently it's part of our regular vocabulary. What goes around perspectives on pandemics in Jewish history. Now, someone mentioned to me that he's wondering how the people in the 1918 survived the Spanish flu and the pandemic. At that time, without having memes and WhatsApps and Facebook and Twitter, all the jokes that have been going around. So today I got one, and I figured it's apropos to share. They say, why is it called pandemics? And that's because pandas eat for 14 hours a day. And so no wonder they gave the name to this current situation, pandemics. For those of us that are locked up in the house, or were at least now, we're slowly but surely getting back into normal scheduling. So the pandemic, we're all used to it. It's changed not only our lives, but it's changed the lives of humanity the world over, something which is unparalleled in the history, really. The markets, the health, the lockdowns, everything that has come along together with the pandemic has been shocking and has been something which has uprooted us in our core. But for the Jewish community in particular, we've had specific changes to our communities, being that we are so focused on our shuls, on our schools, on our communities, and our communal gatherings. The Pesach Seder was changed. Everything about it affected us specifically as Jews. And so during this class, we're going to analyze it from a Jewish perspective. What the pandemic, I guess, teaches us, what the history teaches us, because as Jews, we've been around for thousands of years and we have a long and rich history, whether it's a literal history of the stories, the anecdotes, or academic history from the great sages throughout the ages who had what to say on plagues, epidemics, pandemics, and how that affects us this very day. The class is split. It's going to be 1 hour. It's split into 3 sections. One section, the first one, we're going to focus on practical guidance and medical advice, which is found in traditional Jewish sources. The second section, we're going to focus on responses from a religious or spiritual point of view. And the third section is changes to communal customs and the practicality of Jewish life, the effect that the pandemic has on us and then for generations to come. It's a recorded class, and between each section, I'll stop for question and answers, as well as at the end, I'll stop for question and answers. During question and answers, it will not be recorded, so feel free to ask away whatever you'd like. So we'll get right into it. Where would we start if not from the Talmud? Practical guidelines from the Talmud. In the times of the Talmud, and the Talmud is a massive compendium of different teachings from different sages throughout the ages, and finally completed around the 4th and 5th century of the Common Era, about 1,500 years ago. And in the Talmud, there was a lot that went on then, and there's a lot that is being discussed in the Talmud. Most of the Talmud analyzes issues and ideas from a purely spiritual point of view, from a religious dimension, spiritual dimension, but sprinkled throughout are very practical nuggets of advice and even some medicinal information, especially in relation to pandemics. Now, in those days, medicine was at its infancy. The germ theory hadn't been discovered yet, as well as many hygienic practices that we take for granted nowadays hadn't been discovered. But nonetheless, there are some very interesting tidbits from the Talmud on pandemics. And we'll get right into it. Rabbi Yochanan says, be careful of the flies found on those afflicted with ra'atan, as they are carriers of the disease. Ra'atan was a type of infectious disease that was going around then at that time and during the Talmudic times. And so Rabbi Yochanan says, be careful, they're carriers of the disease, be careful of the flies. Another tidbit of information, Rabbi Zera, in the Talmud, he would not sit in a spot where the wind blew from the direction of someone afflicted with Ra'atan. Rabbi Elazar would not enter the tent of one afflicted with Ra'atan. I guess the precursor to social distancing. So Ra'atan seemed to be an infectious disease that went around in the time of the Talmud, very similar to viral diseases that we know nowadays. Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi, two great sages, would not eat eggs from an alley in which someone afflicted with Ra'atan lived. Now, reading through these tidbits, it seems that, okay, granted not the final one about the eggs from the alley, but the other three are straight out of the CDC textbook. Don't go in close proximity to someone who's afflicted with the virus. Don't sit downwind of someone who has the virus. You don't want to get the viral. Don't get in contact with the fleas. So these are things that you can find in all the medical directives nowadays, and it's right there for you in the Talmud. It continues, two more interesting ones. Rava kept his windows shut during an epidemic. The Talmud in Bava Kama relates that there was an epidemic at that time, and the sages announced that everyone should remain locked into their homes. A lockdown for a pandemic, for an epidemic. So Rava took it a step further and he locked his windows. He kept his windows shut during the epidemic so he shouldn't be affected. Again, this is from the Talmud. And one final quote, the rabbis advised that when traveling during an epidemic, one should stick to the sides of the street. Why should one stick to the sides of the street? So the commentaries explain that it's somewhat of a spiritual perspective, and that is the idea that the Talmud tells us that during a time of an epidemic, the Malach HaMavis, the angel of death, walks in the center of the street. In the center of the street. And so if you'd like to avoid the angel of death, walk on the sides of the street. But this would also seem to be a very sound practical advice, the idea of walking on the side of the street where there are less foot traffic, where there's less foot traffic. In other words, somewhat of social distancing that we now take for granted and practice nowadays, have been doing for the past few months. And so here we see that the Talmud is giving us very clear directives on how to handle epidemics. That's the Talmudic times, once again, during the 4th or 5th century of the Common Era. Moving right along, we have the era of the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch is, following the Talmud, the most widely accepted, authoritative halachic text. It's the code of Jewish law from which all Jewish law is studied. And it was completed in 1555, mid-16th century. It was written by Rabbi Yosef Cairo, the great Sephardic sage who later lived in Tzfat. And there are comments on it by the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, who lived at the same time period in Krakow, kind of notes for the Ashkenazic community as well. And so it's written and it's accepted by all Jews across the board. And in the times of the Shulchan Aruch, there are also its fair share of pandemics and epidemics. And so the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserlis of Krakow, he issues an interesting legal ruling regarding plagues. And he writes, if possible, one should escape a city when an epidemic appears in that city. One should escape a pandemic city. Now, the commentaries qualify that statement, and they say, obviously, that's early on in the outspread, if you're able to leave the city, if it hasn't spread far and wide, as well as one interesting commentary explains that there's an important qualification. If one is healthy and strong and able-bodied, he should stick around in the plagued city to help those who are unable to help themselves. And so we'll get to that a little bit more on. But it's interesting to note that the Ramah Rabbi Moshe Isserles, who writes this ruling, was actually affected by the cholera epidemic in 1555 itself. And there was an epidemic there in Krakow, and he had to leave his city. And he records it, as we shall soon see. Another instance of Jewish literature of an epidemic is found in 1831. What epidemic was in 1831? Numerous Jewish communities, and actually communities from around the world, were affected and suffered from bouts of cholera from 1816 through 1966. There were 7 major outbreaks, and millions of people died from it. One major outbreak took place in 1831. Now, the outbreaks had such a strong effect on the Jewish communities that cholera was actually Hebraicized into the words cholera. Cholera, which literally means an evil sickness. And to the degree that nowadays not so much, but it used to be actually, it was a kind of a form of curse. People would call someone else a cholera, which was a slang for an evil person, but it was a play on the cholera word, the Hebrew being choli ra, an evil sickness. And so it took a very strong toll on the Jewish communities. But in 1831, the great sage, Hungarian sage, Rabbi Akiva Eger, took great lengths to institute rules and regulations for his community that actually stemmed the tide of the epidemic, to the degree that the local government actually gave him a commendation for his help in stemming the spread of the local cholera epidemic. What were some of his rules? One famous rule was that he instituted that a minyan, whenever Jewish people pray together in a synagogue, sometimes you can have 1,000 people, 500 people. The larger synagogues, they have thousands of people. He instituted that a synagogue, a minyan, is not allowed to have more than 15 people praying at once. And he instituted an entire system that there should be 15 people who pray together. When they finish, they should say a select few psalms for that current situation at the time, immediately leave, and following them a short while later, another group of people should be able to enter to continue praying. And he actually said that they should speak to the police to post a guard at the door of the synagogue to ensure that no more than 15 people enter the synagogue at once. And as I mentioned, he actually received a commendation from the local government. So these are down-to-earth and directives from rabbis throughout the ages to stem the tide of epidemics. We find an interesting one in 1848. In the city of Vilna, in 1848, Vilnius in Lithuania. Vilna is very famous for the founding of the Musar movement, one of the greatest cities of Torah Judaism in the shtetl, in the old country. And in 1848, there was a terrible cholera epidemic in Vilnius. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, Rabbi Yisrael Lipkin, known as Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, was very concerned. As a result, this pandemic took place in the summer of 1848. And following the summer comes the high holiday season, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. And so he was very worried. Yom Kippur is a time when many, many people fast. It's 25 hours of fasting. Who said people will be able to handle it? So despite the severity of the biblical rules in place for Yom Kippur being the most serious fast, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter placed signs, hung signs throughout the entire city, urging that anyone who felt any sort of weakness should eat and drink on this holiest fast day. As a matter of fact, there is some accounts that say that he himself, in the synagogue, right after the morning prayers, made Kiddush on Yom Kippur to prove that it's the right thing to do in such a serious time. that aspect was not without controversy. There were many rabbis who felt that was taking it too far. And Yom Kippur is 25 hours and people can handle it. Obviously, if someone's very sick, then from the get-go, there's no issue of them breaking their fast, drinking, eating, whatnot. But for the average person, they can handle 25 hours of fasting. Nonetheless, he was a great rabbi. And we see that this kind of changing or being somewhat lenient on rules of Judaism, of Torah law, why is it so important? In other words, if God is the one who told us that we should do these rules, obviously God is telling us that you can do them, and if you do them, you won't be harmed. The Talmud actually says that those who are doing a mitzvah have God watching over them, that they won't get injured, that they won't get hurt. So why this change we see in the Code of Jewish Law, in the Talmud, Rabbi Akiva Eger, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter? Why do we see, and many, many other sages throughout history, that they either broke or limited the rules of the Torah in times of epidemics? And so these ideas and concepts are actually based on two cardinal rules on the Jewish attitude to medical issues. These are two very basic rules which are very different than other religions. And it's important to note that. The first rule is, in Hebrew, is pikuach nefesh deicha kol haTorah. It's a law in the Torah that preservation of life precedes all. That's the first cardinal rule of Torah. The second one is, doctors have been given a mandate to heal. And in Hebrew, nitna reshus lerofe lerapes. Doctors have been given a mandate to heal. What does that mean? The first principle of preservation of life precedes all is what allowed Rabbi Yisrael Salanter to eat on Yom Kippur. It's what allowed Rabbi Akiva Eger to limit prayer in Shul. It's what allowed the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, in 1555 to leave his city, leave the Shul, leave the schools, limit his Jewish practice to a certain degree in certain areas. The fact that preservation of life precedes all. When it comes to preservation of life, when it comes to fulfilling of the Torah, there are actually only three laws, three mitzvahs that it says that come what may, a Jew has to sacrifice themselves for the fulfillment of those laws. Those three, they're the three cardinal laws, and no, eating pork is not one of them. Kashrus, eating pork is part of kashrus, and it's not one of the three cardinal sins, if you will. I know it's a common misconception. I get it all the time that the worst sin is eating pork. But it's a sin, shouldn't be done. But the only three sins where it says Yaharig Val Yaver, a person should sacrifice their life rather than transgress those three laws, are the three laws of idolatry, certain forms of sexual crimes like incest and adultery, and murder. What does it mean? It means if someone comes to one's head with a gun and says, murder someone else or I'll murder you. No matter what, a person isn't allowed to murder. The same goes with adultery, and the same goes with idol worship. These are the three cardinal sins. But for all other sins, generally speaking, if it's life or death, according to Torah, one transgresses the sin. Goes ahead. Why? Because preservation of life precedes all. And so when it comes to a time of going to a minyan versus preserving one's life in time of an epidemic, Torah tells us, in other words, it's not we're setting aside Torah in order to preserve a life. Torah itself tells us that we have to, part of Torah is saving lives. And if part of Torah is saving lives, then definitely it precedes everything, including praying with a minyan or eating on Yom Kippur, etc. We'll get to questions in a moment. Then comes a second principle. Second principle is that from here we see that doctors have been given a mandate to heal. Where does that come from? What's that idea? And the idea is as follows. When someone is sick, God forbid, there's two aspects from a theological point of view that get in the way of going to a doctor. First one is going to a doctor. The doctor might suggest certain procedures or certain medicines which have side effects, which can have detrimental effects. Surgery, God forbid, if needed. These things can have a bad effect on the person. If Torah gives such importance to preservation of life, why should we have a doctor intervene to try to do something when hinged on the second theological concern that some may say is the idea that God gave this person a sickness. God will heal it however he sees fit. God gave the person this sickness. Why intervene in God's direction, in God's rule of the world? And so Judaism tells us on the contrary. The verse tells us, the verse in Exodus says, and he shall surely heal. V'rapoi yirape. The sages comment on those Hebrew words, v'rapoi yirape, that mikan sheniten reshus l'reif el-rapis. From here we see that the Torah is giving us a very clear mandate that doctors have to heal others. In other words, when we go to a doctor to heal us, it's not going outside circumventing godliness or circumventing God's assistance. It's God helping us through the doctor. We have a Jewish Torah moral obligation to go and be healed by a doctor, and for doctors to heal others. So Torah obligates us to follow the guidance of medical professionals. Now, all religions aren't like that. There's some famous other religions or factions of other religions who say that no, on the contrary, one isn't allowed to go to a doctor. One is never allowed to go be healed. And if some situation happens to a community, it's a sign from God and no one should go seek to be healed. I guess a counterexample could be in the early 16th century outbreak of the bubonic plague. Martin Luther, the first, actually said that all the local houses of worship should remain open because it's a punishment from heaven and so on and so forth. And so they should remain steadfast before the peril of death and not close the houses of worship to go seek medical attention and so on. And so this is the exact opposite of what the Torah tells us to do. The Torah obligates us to follow the guidance of medical professionals. And that in turn is God's blessing. It's where we get God's blessings from healing through following the doctor. One of the famous commentaries on the Mishnah, the Tiferes Yisrael, actually quotes Edward Jenner, the one who developed the smallpox vaccine in 1798, and he quotes him as an example of Chasidei Umas Ha'olam, one of the righteous amongst the Gentiles, who has a portion in the world to come in heaven for the fact that he developed the smallpox vaccine. In other words, Torah throughout the ages always saw as medical professionals as part of God's plan in making the world a better place. All this that we just discussed is exactly what's playing out nowadays. Playing out nowadays is we have the medical professionals who are directing us what we should do and what we shouldn't do. Synagogues closed. We didn't have a minyan here in Mar Vista. Chabad of Mar Vista has been closed since Purim. Well, the actual physical place hasn't been closed since Purim, but we've been open. We've never closed. We've had the Torah class going all along, and we've had Judaism even stronger than ever. As we say, one synagogue closed here in Mar Vista, but thousands of others have opened in everyone's houses. And, no Torah reading, no minyan, and so on and so forth. This is not being lenient in the rules of Torah. This is actually fulfilling the rules of Torah of preserving life and following the medical professionals. We'll move on to the second section. Before we do that, if anyone would like to ask a question, feel free to ask your question. You can unmute yourself. We recognize the authority of medical knowledge, and Torah actually gives us the mandate, the obligation to follow the medical knowledge. But that's only half the picture. It's only part of the solution. We realize that everything comes from God, including the virus. Everything is from God. And if everything is from God, that means that we have to have a two-pronged response, a response of a physical response, a response of following the medical knowledge, and we also have to have a spiritual response. We have to channel our faith in God Almighty to our own worldly activities. It's got to kind of trickle down into something literal, into something specific. And I'll give you an example. When it comes to making a living, so yes, we make a living, and the harder we work, the more money one makes, the more successful one is. Usually that's the way it works. We have to work hard in order to make a living. But we have to know that the blessing ultimately comes from God. So it works both ways. It's not that we can sit back, relax, and say, if the blessing comes from God, I'll just sit at home a whole day, twiddle my thumbs, relax on the beach, and I'll make, $500,000 a year because it comes from God. The way God set up the world is that it has to have both sides. There's the spiritual side that ultimately everything comes from God Almighty. But nonetheless, God created a physical world with physical practices involved, including going to work. And God said the way you receive the blessing is by going to work. And so the same thing is when it comes to medical practices, responses to epidemics, pandemics, is yes, we have the medical knowledge that we must follow, that we're obligated to follow, but together with that, we have the spiritual response that we have to give. And so let's move right along and let's see some of these spiritual responses that the Torah gives us throughout the ages to pandemics, to epidemics, and to plagues. The first one is the first time the Jewish people encountered a plague. If you think you may know when the first time the Jewish people encountered a plague, you can write it in the chat box. The first time the Jewish people encountered a plague was right after the Jewish people left Egypt. Immediately following the Exodus, we know the story. They got the 10 plagues. The Egyptians were ruined. They let the Jewish people out, and the Jewish people started going through the desert. A short while later, about a year later, while wandering the deserts, was the rebellion of Korach. Won't get into it. It's in next week's Torah portion. You can join the Torah class Tuesday night, and you'll get the story. But in short, there was a rebellion against Moses. God quashed the rebellion, and following that, there was a plague that strikes the Jewish people. How did the Jewish people stop that plague? They stopped the plague with Ketoret. What is Ketoret? What happened? Moses tells Aaron, who was the high priest, and he says, quickly go get a pan, and in the pan place the incense. The incense was a mixture of spices that was brought as a sacrifice to a degree, an incense on the inner altar in the tabernacle and in the temple. So Moses tells Aaron, and he says, quickly, on a fire pan, get some incense and go straight into the midst of the congregation and atone for their sins with it. Aaron does exactly that. He stands between the living and the dead, and it says the plague is halted. The verse tells us the plague is halted. Where did Moses get this idea that the incense can stop the plague? So the Midrash tells us that when Moses went up to receive the Torah at Mount Sinai, he went to heaven. Every angel gave Moses a different gift, whatever those gifts were. Satan, who was actually an angel, one of the angels on high, Satan gave Moses the gift of Ketoros, the knowledge that incense, Ketoros, can halt a plague. So Moses knew that information. Very simple. We want to halt the pandemic. What do? Let's all do incense right here in Mar Vista. Let's do a grand incense and we'll halt the plague. Right? Sounds simple. If Moses did it, we can do it too. And the answer is no, we can't. Incense was only allowed to be brought on the temple once the temple was built. Once the tabernacle, the temple was built, it was only allowed to be brought in the temple. That means since the temple was destroyed, we can never bring incense. If we can't bring incense, then what use is it for us? We can't bring incense. Why even know about it? It's not something that we can do on the spiritual side of things to stop a plague, to stop a pandemic, especially the current pandemic. Our sages tell us something interesting, that when we study a portion of Torah, even if it's something that we cannot perform nowadays, for example, the Paschal sacrifice is not a sacrifice that we can bring nowadays. Nonetheless, by us studying the relevant Torah portion, the relevant verses associated with that sacrifice, it's as if we are currently bringing the sacrifice. As a result, when it comes to a pandemic, Rabbi Shneir Zalman of Liadi, the first Chabad Rebbe back in the late 18th century, once said that whenever faced with a plague, with an epidemic, what we should do is we should read the portion in the Torah that describes the Ketores. That's what we should do. It's as if we are bringing the Ketores as a sacrifice. Where are those portions? In Exodus, verses 1 through 10 and 22 through 38, in chapter 30, that's about the incense. And in the book of Numbers, next week's Torah portion, the story of Korach and the subsequent saving of and halting the plague with the Ketores. So this is one spiritual response that we can do, is study those verses, read those verses. Actually, the first two, the two from Exodus, we actually read in our daily prayers every single day. And so even if we don't usually say the daily prayers, this is one way, spiritually speaking, how we can combat the pandemic. A second time that there was a pandemic was during King David's reign over Jerusalem, over the Jewish people. The Medrash relates that there was an epidemic which was claiming the lives of 100 people a day. So by divine inspiration, King David decreed that everyone should recite at least 100 blessings every single day. And that will halt the epidemic. Where did King David get this divine inspiration from? So our sages tell us that there's a verse in the book of Deuteronomy which reads as follows. Now, Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you? To walk in his ways and to serve him. The Hebrew word for what is ma. But ma is phonetically similar to the word mea. Ma means what? Mea means 100. So in other words, we can read the verse if we follow the phonetic reading of the letters. We can read the verse, what does God ask of you? Now, Israel, 100 does the Lord your God ask of you. And so by divine inspiration, King David commanded that everyone has to recite 100 blessings a day. Now, we may not be going around to recite 100 blessings. Actually, in the Code of Jewish Law, it explains how one can achieve to reach 100 blessings a day. And if one does the 3 daily prayers, the morning, afternoon, and evening services, and then washes for a meal, does the hamotzi, and a few other blessings, it's covered. It's over 100 blessings. Blessings are Baruch Atah Hashem, those blessings, not just, bless you or have a nice day. And so that's another good idea that we can take, another spiritual idea of combating the pandemic by making more blessings, based on that story of King David. Getting closer to nowadays. The Black Death in the mid-14th century was the pandemic of all pandemics. It was the worst in all of history, and it claimed somewhere between 75 and 200 million lives in the span of about 1 decade, 10 years. It began in China, and it slowly but surely moved to the Crimean Peninsula during the war. And then after that, interestingly enough, they say that was one of the first episodes of biological warfare. They take the corpses that died from the Black Death and they catapult them into an Italian port city. And from there, it spread to Europe proper. And the rest is history, as they say. Disastrous plague began from, I forget the name, Yersinia pestis was the bacterium that caused this plague. It may have been a bubonic plague, and it was something which was terrible. But there was something else interesting that came along with that Black Death. And that was anti-Semitism as the world hadn't seen before. Yes, there was anti-Semitism before then, but the anti-Semitism that came along with the Black Death was terrible. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed as a result of the Black Death, not by the Black Death itself, but by the anti-Semitism that followed. The Jews were blamed for the Black Death. It was said that the Jews poisoned the wells with the Black Death, with this plague. And as a result, thousands of Jews, entire cities of Jews, communities of Jews were wiped out. There was, on the night of Valentine's Day, which is before it took on its romantic meaning of nowadays, it was always a day where Jews were blamed for things. On the night of Valentine's Day in 1364, I believe it was, 1,000 Jews were killed in Strasbourg. Shortly thereafter, there were thousands of Jews killed in Frankfurt, and the entire Jewish community of Erfurt in Germany was murdered, all because the Jews were blamed for the Black Death. Why were the Jews blamed for the Black Death? Now, there isn't concrete evidence, but most historians do say that the Jews suffered disproportionately less than the rest of the communities. Some have suggested that the reason is very simple. There were no hygienic rules that were understood then. It was before germ theory was discovered. And so people weren't used to washing their hands, or when it came to handling dead bodies, corpses, and so on, they went straight to food and things like that. But the Jewish people, on the other hand, we always had Jewish laws that helped us with hygiene. Netilas yadayim, washing our hands, something we do regularly. Washing hands is supposed to be done not just before eating bread, but also first thing waking up in the morning, after using the restroom, after cutting hair, after taking blood. There's a number of times that the Code of Jewish Law says that one should wash their hands because of a spirit of impurity. And so Jews were always constantly washing their hands way before any hygienic understanding was attached to it. As well as, according to Jewish law, a corpse has to be buried immediately, as fast as possible. As well as, following handling a corpse, hands must be washed. Kosher laws include wiping down the surface and cleaning them really well between meat and dairy. So raw meat, raw chicken, that was something that wasn't really, didn't affect the Jewish community as it affected other communities. Cleaning out the grain storehouses before Passover. Once a year, the whole house would get a big clean over. I guess spring cleaning didn't hit the world yet. So because of these Jewish practices, the Jewish community had a reduced effect from the Black Death. So that's something else that we can also strengthen, which are the Jewish laws, specifically connected to the hygienic Jewish laws, whether it's kosher, whether it's washing our hands, to do it more often as a spiritual response to the plague, and it has a literal side effect, if you will. Another interesting response to a plague comes from the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov is the founder of Hasidic movement. He lived he was born in 1698, he passed away in 1760. He was a great scholar, great sage. He lived in the city of Mezhebush in Russia. And at one point there was a plague. Multiple people were dying every single day, and the community came rushing to the Baal Shem Tov asking him, what shall we do? And the Baal Shem Tov, basing it on a verse in the prophets, the Baal Shem Tov said that the Jewish people should write a special Torah scroll as a response to the health issues, and as they write the Torah scroll, the pandemic will stop. Immediately, the community got together. They hired the Baal Shem Tov's personal scribe. They wrote a new Torah scroll, and shortly thereafter, the plague stopped. The Baal Shem Tov explained that the unity which is caused by all people purchasing a letter in the Torah scroll, that creates a certain blessing for the entire community and will halt the pandemic. Actually, nowadays, the same response has been done. There's been a number of Torah scrolls that have been written as a response to the current pandemic. I believe 3 have been written. 1 has already been completed, which is a tremendous feat, being that it usually takes a year of writing a Torah scroll. They began writing it shortly before Purim, and if I'm not mistaken, a few weeks ago, they actually completed the first Torah scroll, which means hundreds of thousands of people have participated in purchasing a letter. And some of you may have done it already. If you haven't, you can go to unitedforprotection.com, unitedforprotection.com, and purchase your own letter. It's $1 or something just to take part in this tremendous action of Jewish unity. And as the Baal Shem Tov said in the mid 18th century, that is a way to ward off the pandemic. In 1827, in Orsha, there was another pandemic, a local plague of the bubonic plague, and the Tzemach Tzedek said that a good way to, the third Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, said that a good way to ward off the pandemic comes from the statement in the Talmud that giving charity wards off death, and so increase in charity. Not just increase in charity, but actually give it in small increments throughout the day or throughout the week, not just one big donation once a year, twice a year, 3 times a year, but regularly have a charity box in your home and regularly put in a nickel, put in a dime, put in a quarter, whether it's 3 times a day, once a day. Do it regularly throughout the day, and that'll help ward off anything evil connected with death, including an epidemic. In 1848, there was a plague in Israel, and the Tzemach Tzedek suggested that as a response to the spiritual response to the plague in Israel, not only should people say the 100 blessings as we know from King David, but actually say the blessings with more meaning and fervor. A very interesting source. Now, preceding were all ideas that are mentioned clearly in the Torah in different Jewish, and clearly in different Jewish sources as a response to epidemics and plagues. Black weddings is a response which was found somewhat throughout history, which was found even in Jewish communities, and in some places we find Jewish explanations to the idea of a black wedding. What is a black wedding? There's a town called Apt. Apt is a town in Europe, small town. It had a sizable Jewish community. And the memorial book for the town of Apt relates that there was a certain holy rabbi that was approached during a plague and was asked, what should we do during the cholera epidemic of 1892? What should we do to counter this pandemic? How do we stop this epidemic? He thought for a moment, and he said that they should find an orphan who doesn't have the funds or the means to marry, and they should marry him off. It's a big mitzvah to help an orphan get married, pay for the funds to get what's needed. And so they found an orphan in the community, and there was a matchmaker involved, and I don't know how long it took, but they found them a match, and there was a girl, and she was actually a kailichdike yasam, as they say. She was a rounded orphan. She didn't have a mother or a father. And they decided to get married. The rabbi said that the marriage, the wedding, should take place in the cemetery. Why in the cemetery? Because that's where all the people from the community are buried. The parents, the grandparents, the great-grandparents, many great sages and great rabbis are buried. And God willing, by them seeing, spiritually seeing, this mitzvah of marrying off an orphan, 2 orphans, being performed with such great joy by the community, and everyone helping and being joyous in their marriage, that itself will inspire the souls to go intercede on behalf of the community, and that will stop the epidemic. As a matter of fact, we find that not only that in 1892 in the city of Apt, but even here in the United States, in Cobb's Creek in 1918 in Pennsylvania, we find that they made a wedding in a cemetery for that same reason. They had 1,200 people in Cobb's Creek wedding in 1918, and that was to ward off the Spanish flu. Now, that definitely does have superstitious undertones, and it's definitely different than the preceding 6 ideas that we mentioned, which do have clear roots in Jewish sources. But nonetheless, this has its issues, but nonetheless, it's still an interesting idea. Nowadays, in Israel, they actually performed a wedding in the cemetery as well, shortly after Purim, at the beginning of the outbreak, once again for that same purpose. As you can see in the picture here, that's if I'm not mistaken, that's a wedding in Bnei Brak in Israel, in the cemetery. The underlying idea of all of these 7 ideas that we had to study the Ketores, the incense, because we can't bring it nowadays. We had reciting 100 blessings or just adding in blessings, adding in Jewish practices, especially associated with cleanliness, kosher, washing our hands, and so on. Writing a Torah scroll, participating, unitedforprotection.com, giving added charity, having a charity box, organizing, or the final one of organizing a wedding. The overarching theme to all of these responses, however, is that strengthening our connection to Hashem, to God Almighty, through the observance of Torah and mitzvahs is what brings blessings to us and to the world around us. And this basic view is expressed in the book of Exodus. What does God say? If you hearken to the voice of the Lord your God, and you do what is proper in his eyes, and you listen closely to his commandments, and observe all his statutes, all the sicknesses that I have visited upon Egypt, I will not visit upon you. For I, the Lord, heal you. It's not just random ideas to ward off the pandemic or any time there's something negative that's coming our way. These ideas actually are based on the ethics of our fathers. Tells us that the world is being held up by 3 pillars: the pillar of Torah, the pillar of Teshuvah, and the of Avoda, Teshuvah, and the pillar of Gemilot Chasadim, of study of Torah, of serving God, prayer, repentance, and of doing good deeds. And so if those are the 3 pillars that hold up the world, then if you have a shaky table, what's the best way to stop the shake? Fixing the legs. And so if we have a shaky table, in other words, if our world is going through a shaky time, what's the best way to hold up the world, to fix the world, to do our best? What's our part that we can do? By fixing the spiritual legs, by fixing the legs of Torah study, of fulfilling the mitzvahs, and of gemilot chasadim, charity, helping others, and so on. Those are the spiritual responses. I will move on to section 3 just a moment. If anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question. Pandemics. First change in Jewish life that we find is actually something very interesting. There's an assistant professor of history at Stony Brook University that wrote an article called A Pinkas in a Plague Year. A Pinkas is kind of a communal ledger that every community used to write, and nowadays some communities still have it, but they don't. And he actually, 2 years ago, his name is Joshua Teplitsky, 2 years ago, he started researching this, and he wrote, he says, I didn't know how relevant it was going to be. And he came across something interesting, that in 1713, there was a plague, and there was an individual that showed up in Prague. Why did he show up in Prague? He was running away. His name was Anshel. He was running away from his town where there was a plague, and he was heeding the advice of the Code of Jewish Law that said that when there's a plague, you should run away. So he ran away, and he arrived in Prague. The problem is he arrived in Prague, and in Prague, there was the same plague. It had reached Prague. And so he was about to leave Prague. And what happened was, just before he was about to leave Prague, he went to the local Jewish court. In the midst of his flight, with his future uncertain, Anshel unveiled himself to the standing Jewish court in Prague to make provisions for his family. He settled his affairs. Our sages tell us that it's actually a good way to ward off death is preparing a will and updating one's will. Buying a plot as well is one of the things that are mentioned by the Jewish sages, by our sages, that tell us that that will ward off death by preparing, by settling affairs. And so we see that Anshel, that's what he did, and they felt it important enough to write it in the Pinkas of Prague in 1713. Until today, that's actually something that's practiced, that during such times of upheaval, it's a common Jewish practice to prepare a will if one doesn't have one, or to update one's will, and obviously to include charities as beneficiaries, somewhat, some percentage, as we mentioned earlier, that another way to ward off death is by giving charity. Another interesting idea is something that we're all common with, and that is quarantine. Where does quarantine come from? Where does the word quarantine come from? The word quarantine comes from, in the 14th century, they attempted to ward off epidemics from spreading through coastal cities. People coming from different places, landing in the port cities, and from there it can spread to the whole city. So what they do, they would keep the ships offshore for 40 days. That's where the name quarantine comes from. In Italian, it's 40 days is 40 giorni. And so that's where quarantine comes from, the 40-day period that they would hold these ships offshore, a period of isolation to make sure that they weren't sick. Isolation we find in the Torah, it's as if someone had the spiritual leprosy of tsaras, they would actually have to be in isolation from everyone else. But this idea of isolation actually could be an extraordinary opportunity. We've all been in isolation, we've all been in quarantine, it's slowly ending, but the question is, what have we accomplished in isolation, in quarantine? What does that mean? Some of the greats throughout history have accomplished tremendous things. They say Isaac Newton, it said, actually developed calculus and thought of the theory of gravity while he was holed away in an English countryside during a plague year. He had time to think, he had time to be alone. And we find our sages throughout the ages actually accomplished tremendous things during quarantine themselves. The great Chida in 1774, he was quarantined for 40 days in Italy, not as a result of a plague, but as a result of the literal quarantine. He had just traveled, and they were keeping him offshore. And in those 40 days being held offshore, quarantine, he wrote a book which is over 200 pages of a phenomenal bibliographical work on Jewish writers from the beginning of time until his period. And it's actually a book, I have it here, it's over 200 pages, it's called Shem HaGdolim, and it's used extensively. And it's found in every Jewish library. And he wrote that in under 40 days in his quarantine. He utilized his time of quarantine. The Ramah that we mentioned earlier, there was a plague in the city of Krakow in 1555, and that plague happened over Purim. What do we do on Purim? We give gifts of food to our friends and neighbors. He couldn't give any gifts of food. There was nobody with him. He was alone. He was isolated. He was quarantined. So what did he do? What he did was he wrote a book. He wrote a scholarly work on the book of Esther, and he gifted it to his father as Mishloach Manot. That book is called Mechir Yayin. It's over 100 pages, and it's great insights in a great Jewish work on the book of Esther. He utilized the opportunity of quarantine. The next thing that is something that is interesting that changed the way we behave in certain Jewish areas. In 1831, we mentioned earlier, there was a great outbreak of the cholera plague, and Rabbi Akiva Eiger was the one who instituted no more than 15 million people in a minyan. But there's something else that he instituted that we actually do till today. It used to be that when people had to say Kaddish for the loss of a loved one, we know that Kaddish is said for 11 months. And then following the 11 months, Kaddish is said every year on the yahrzeit. What happens if you have 15 people who have to say Kaddish on the same day? Everyone says it together. When did that begin? In 1831. What happened was there were so many, it used to be, the rule was that there would be one person who would say the Kaddish, and he would have in mind everyone else. And so every day or every prayer, they would alternate, and everyone would get a chance once a day, once in 2 days, to say the Kaddish, having in mind everyone else. The problem is in 1831, beginning in 1831, so many people had passed, and there were so many mourners who would have to say the Kaddish, that as a result, it would come out that people would say the Kaddish maybe once a month, if they continued that rotating process. And so Rabbi Akiva Eiger instituted that everyone should say Kaddish in unison. That began then, and until today, if you walk into a synagogue that has many people that have to say Kaddish, they all say it together. Till today. Nowadays, we have a concept called a porch minyan. Anyone familiar with a porch minyan? If last year you came over to me and you said, Rabbi, I have a great idea. There are many, many Jewish people living on Federal Avenue. I have a great idea. Everyone should come out on their front lawn. Someone with a loud voice should say the prayers in the front and the corner of Federal and or maybe in the middle of the street on Federal, should say the prayers, and everyone can answer Amen. We have a minyan, we'll have 10 people. I'd look at you like you fell from the moon. And any rabbi would look at you like it's something concerning. But guess what? Pandemic changed that. Nowadays, a porch minyan is common. You walk through the streets of Brooklyn, you walk through La Brea, you walk through Pico, the side streets during the time of prayer, you're definitely going to hear. Now a little bit less, being that synagogues have been slowly reopening. But especially in the times of in March and April, when everyone was staying at home, they had porch minyanim. Everyone would stay on their porch, and with 10 people within a certain place, you'd have it. So this is something that probably won't stick around. We probably won't be having these porch minyanim as the Kaddish stuck around. But nonetheless, this is something that changed in a ritual that we're all comfortable with, and it changed. Another thing is online study, something we're doing now that probably is going to stick around for another while. It's a good thing. And even if we return, God willing, soon to return to regular classes, in-person classes, which I'm sure we're all hoping will continue very shortly, nonetheless, I myself considering continuing to broadcasting online. Now, although there have been many Jewish communities who have been broadcasting online for many, many years, the Rebbe, Chabad in general, has been broadcasting online since it's been available. Chabad.org it was actually one of the first 500 websites in the entire world. If I'm not mistaken, even before Coca-Cola.com. Nonetheless, there are many Jewish communities that haven't been broadcasting online as a result of the pandemic have began and will probably continue. It's a good thing that has come out of, I guess, a silver lining from the pandemic. Bikur Cholim, visiting the sick, or the goodness that has and kindness that has been sprouting from people throughout the world. It's just amazing, an amazing response, and God willing, it should continue. Throughout history, we find it. Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik, a great sage in the late 19th century, during a cholera outbreak, he would tend to those who were afflicted with cholera, even when others were afraid to do so. And he writes that he wouldn't go to those who were extremely serious cases, but those with mild cases, he would attend to them. And something fascinating was what the Rebbe's mother related. In 1922, there was a terrible typhus outbreak in Yekaterinoslav and the surrounding area in Ukraine, current Ukraine, former Soviet Union. And everyone was staying away from those who were afflicted with typhus. They had special typhus wards. And the Rebbe, being all but 20 years old at the time, and who was someone who would spend up to 18, 20 hours a day studying Torah, felt it important that at that time he has to go and help those who can help themselves, being that they're afflicted with typhus. Come what may to his own health, he has to help others. And as a matter of fact, shortly thereafter, the Rebbe developed an extremely high fever, and the Rebbe contracted typhus. And the Rebbe's mother actually related that in moments of delirium, the Rebbe would mutter words of Hasidic thought. And shortly thereafter, the Rebbe recuperated. And so the idea is that even nowadays, we see the courageous healthcare workers, the essential workers, patient advocates, and everyone involved in the healthcare system, and all those who have been helping have been going above and beyond. People with their neighbors, and one local community member told me that he's gotten to know his neighbors. He's lived on the same block for 20 years. He never knew his neighbors so well. The kindness and generosity that's been coming from everyone at this time, the entire world, is something beautiful. It's definitely something that should stay with us even after the pandemic leaves us. And so, to conclude with one final thought, and that is as follows. One recurring theme that we find throughout history, whenever tough times, plagued the world, plagued us in particular, the Jewish people, we find that the prayer wasn't that this should end. The prayer was that this should end and Mashiach should come. The story is told of a great rabbi, one of the great rabbis of the previous generation who lived through the Holocaust, and he never cried. during the entire time of the Holocaust, through Auschwitz, through everything he went through all those terrible times, he never cried. He made Aliyah, he came to Israel following the war, he survived the Holocaust, he came to Israel, and shortly thereafter he started crying. He would cry and cry at every moment he would be crying. And so his students asked him, why, Rabbi, why are you crying? You didn't cry throughout the destruction, why are you crying now? And so the rabbi answered as follows. He said, throughout the destruction, throughout the Holocaust, my hopes and prayers were that this will end, but not just end, it'll end with the coming of Mashiach. There's labor pains, but following the labor pains is the birth. And so if the coming of Mashiach will follow with these, I'm not crying yet. He says, but now, when the Holocaust ended, and I made it to Israel, and Mashiach is still not here, now I'm crying for all the pain and suffering that I went through throughout, and everyone went through throughout the Holocaust. When it comes to this period of time, where now the Rebbe repeated over and over again that the time of redemption has arrived and Mashiach is just about to come, he's so near, Mashiach is so near. And so now our prayer isn't just that the pandemic should end, isn't just that the pain and suffering that those around the world are enduring should end, but our prayer is, we hope and pray that this will be the last darkness before the great light of the final redemption of the coming of Mashiach. May Mashiach come speedily in our days. Continue praying with no more suffering and no more pain and no more death. Death will be erased from the earth together with the pandemic. And may Mashiach come now. Amen. Thank you all for joining. And I'm going to stick around. If anyone has any questions, then feel free to ask.